Hey there, IndyCar fans. This is Nathan Brown, your motorsports insider with the Indianapolis Star, here for the debut edition of a podcast we're relaunching covering everything IndyCar called The Inside Line. I'm joined with my new co-host, motorsports veteran reporter Joey Barnes. You've read Joey Barnes's work in lots of places over the last dozen plus years covering IndyCar, IMSA, among other things. Really happy that Joey decided to join me on this as we reboot this again ahead of the 2025 IndyCar season. Joey, thanks so much for hopping on today, and of course, following through the IndyCar season that we'll be breaking down here just about every single week, especially once we get to the summer here with races coming fast and furious. How you doing?
I'm doing great, man. I'm excited. We're finally getting ready for a new season. It's exciting to finally get this podcast rolling that we've been talking about for several months now. And I just really looking forward to what this year is going to bring. I mean, there's so many things that we're going to dive into, obviously, with the off season and what's taken place, because there's a lot, and it's been a long off season. It's been a very busy off season. And then obviously getting ready for what's hopefully a really fun 2025.
So this podcast, if you guys are listening to this, you may have listened to previous iterations of IndyCar Weekly, a podcast that my predecessor Jim Aiello started with Connor Daly back. It was 6 years ago, I think now, and run through a couple co-hosts since then. But one thing I'm really excited having Joey join me this year and hopefully into the future is a way that this podcast can be a little bit of a different experience for IndyCar fans out there. There's a handful of podcasts that come to mind that cover the sport in a variety of different ways, from fans that just kind of chit chat periodically about the sport. You have other journalists either that are solo on their pod or have guests constantly, or break it, maybe a driver who brings it down with a friend, or another media colleague of ours who breaks it down with a driver. But when I was thinking about the future of what this podcast could be, I felt like there was a niche out there for two motorsports journalists who have been covering the sport in IndyCar in particular for the last several years, to just kind of come together after every single race, break things down on the track, break things down off the track. Joey and I hope to be at most races this season. I'm still working out my travel schedule, as is Joey, but if you enjoy this, these couple preseason episodes that we will have here before things get rolling and cars get on track in St. Pete, I encourage you to look out for it. We hope to tape Mondays or Tuesdays after every single race, and we'll go for about an hour or so, and we'll just kind of share our thoughts on things that we either experienced at the track, watched on the race broadcast. It can be team related, driver related, championship related, TV broadcast related. Obviously, as we get into the new Fox relationship, there'll be a lot to discuss coming out of St. Pete. But just hope this is a project for both of us that can stand out and be a little bit different for what's offered out there in the motorsports podcasting landscape. If you have any thoughts, suggestions for segments, for guests, things that you want to have us talk about, reach out to both of us on social media. We love feedback, and we're really excited to just kind of see where this season and this podcast takes us the rest of this year. But without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Joey, what are we talking about here on this episode today?
I mean, I think the biggest thing, we've got to start talking about this off season. I know I kind of teased it at the beginning intro of our new podcast, The Inside Line. And, it's one of those situations where there's so many things to dive into with this off season. There's so many new things. We've got the TV partner. We've got new races coming in 26. I mean, there's just a plethora. Obviously, going down the line, charters was another thing. I've got to just immediately dive into it here, though, right? I think the important thing is, the most important off-season storyline, in my opinion, it's Fox is a big deal. Long Beach, Penske Entertainment buying Long Beach is a big deal. But I think you've really got to. For me, it was the Arlington race. I think when you look at the level of partnership that's involved with the Dallas Cowboys owner Jerry Jones, with Rev, that's a big partner with the World Series champions from 2 years ago, Texas Rangers, and having a street race in downtown Arlington. One, it's interesting on so many levels, just because you're also taking away from Texas Motor Speedway, which is only 20 miles, 30 miles north of the venue that's going to be had there in 26. I was at the announcement back in October, and it had I've covered Formula One races, and so I understand the different level of energies that kind of exist within different landscapes, NASCAR, IMSA, IndyCar. This was as close to a hype train of Formula One levels that I've ever experienced for an IndyCar event. The amount of people that were at Texas Live was absolutely insane. The amount of just buzz that existed in that building for an announcement like this, and obviously the ownership star power that was there was absolutely on another level. And I think the track layout is wonderful. I think it's beautiful. I'm really fascinated to see how it races, obviously. But I think also when I look at the landscape of that event, I think there's also so many questions, right? I think you look at that and you go, okay, we know we're aiming for a March. Is it going to clash with the Cup date at COTA? Are we waiting on the date to figure out what NASCAR is going to do with the Cup date? So that way we're not looking at some sort of clash there. And then equally, what's the long-term future of an event like this? Year one is always going to be fantastic, right? We all know that. But what are you going to do in year two? What are you going to do in year three? Is this a situation where this is temporary and eventually we go back to Texas Motor Speedway, or are we completely done with that? I think there's so many things that you look at that and go, like where is the future of the sport? And I think that the other end of this could be a gateway to many other things, because when you got a guy like Jerry Jones involved, I'm a Niners fan, so I'm gonna just take the minute to bash the Cowboys. If we got Cowboys listeners, I'm not going to apologize. You know, they haven't won a championship in forever, but they're clearly one of the biggest brands in sports, and they still are, despite the fact they haven't won a Super Bowl in 30 years. So
But who's counting?
yeah, right. Just me. But you look at that and you're like, okay, we know that they're talking about races in Denver. We know that they're talking about races in Mexico. So where does this transcend to? Does this become part of the norm, where when Penske Entertainment is not necessarily the big backer of the promotional efforts, and does it move into stick and ball sports? Do we get the ownership group of the Denver Broncos involved in some level? And we all know who's part of that ownership group, a certain Formula One driver that's pretty well known, and
Who will be wearing red this year?
who will be wearing red. Yeah. And so, to me, I think that stands out only because people have been saying, like, what is that next big thing? Like, we know TV partners are important. We know all these other elements that for a new car and everything else like that's important. But how are we going to actually push this to another level? How do we actually promote this to another level? And that race to me signifies the real step forward. And in my opinion, it was really the big mark of the off season that started everything rolling. With that came the trickle down effect of everything that followed. And I think that was kind of a catalyst to a lot of things, and it could be a catalyst for many things in the future.
Agreed. Just to clarify real quick, because I don't know that we explained it super well at the top, Joey and I are kind of going through a draft of sorts. He obviously has the first pick. We are going through our 5 most impactful off-season developments here in IndyCar. So starting with everything that happened after Colton Herta took the checkered flag at Nashville Super Speedway up until right now. We are taping on Tuesday, February 18th. Not exactly sure yet what date you guys might be listening to this right now. And as we know, as we've learned of these last couple weeks, news can come fast and furious and sometimes out of the blue. So want to get that out there. Joey's first pick here in this draft, the Arlington race. And we will just go back and forth, overlap or not overlap picks. So I won't pick Arlington. We'll go back and forth and discuss them more. Before we move on to another one, Joey, I can't remember if you have been or not, but it seems like a good question. As you mentioned, the fact that you've covered a handful of F1 races. Have you been to the Miami Grand Prix in the few years since that launched?
Not Miami.
Okay.
I've been to COTA several times for events down there. What's funny is you mentioned Miami, and I heard from so many different people that drivers, team members, et cetera, that there was a buzz and an energy about that announcement with Arlington that reminded them of Miami. And obviously, I don't know. I can't speak to how true this is, so I got to stress that first. But there was something being said with the fact that I forget who it was, but they were telling me that Jerry Jones saw what the Miami Dolphins owner had and said, "I want that."
Yep.
And that's kind of what started the process of this. And obviously, Roger Penske, being as respected as he is in many, many circles, and pretty much every circle, and undoubtedly has had conversations with Jerry Jones in the past. I think that all kind of heightened. And frankly, let's be real about it. You're getting a series that wants more, and you're getting it at a fraction of the price, because F1 is probably not going to bring a fourth American race, right? But equally, I mean, compare the cost, right? The sanctioning fees, et cetera. So, I mean, it just makes sense on so many levels. It's a little bittersweet for me because I love Texas Motor Speedway. It's my home track. I grew up 5 minutes from there, and it put on some of the best races. At the same time, I'm very fascinated to see what this new venture can do.
Agreed. The thing that we still don't know yet that I'm very interested to see kind of flesh out over the next 12, 13 months or so before this race is going to be held, presumably in late March of 2026. All I know is that it's going to fall sometime between St. Pete and Long Beach, but we haven't gotten an exact race date as far as I'm aware. I'm interested to see what else they do for fans that attend this race. You and I have been to plenty IndyCar street races. They a lot of times kind of have a little bit of a carnival vibe without the roller coasters and the Ferris wheel, but you've got food stands, and maybe sometimes you have some sort of a small concert stage, but there's not, at least from what I've always experienced, like there's not a whole lot going on other than the stuff that you have going on track, and the vibe and the talk. So much of these F1 races, particularly Miami and Vegas, since they launched, both of them launched over these last couple of years in the US, is the fan experience and how much of a bragging right it is to say, hey, I went to this event. I was in, I had tickets to get into whatever suite or whatever experience that was kind of cordoned off from just the general admission area. You've got folks who pay several hundreds of dollars just to get in the gate at Miami, but then there's ways in which that you can upgrade your experience, whether it's watching the races on the yachts that sit on the fake water that they have in Miami, or watching in a suite, or being at a team's kind of sponsored hospitality area. I'm really interested to see how much of the F1 playbook IndyCar and the Rangers and the Cowboys take to make this feel a little bit either like or not like an F1 race. Some of the best, most I feel like exciting from an on-track perspective. IndyCar races that we have so far outside the 500 right now are your events like Iowa that, that have a couple concerts. Oval races are, again, a little different because there's just only so much on-track action that you can have, and you need to give fans a days-long experience while they're inside the gates. But I'm just really intrigued to see what the vibe of this race is. Is it, is it an event that is essentially made and done for your big sponsors and potential partners? Is it an event that an everyday fan can still attend, isn't priced out of, and is getting enough for their, potentially several $100 ticket? Like those are some of the questions that I feel like we haven't gotten answered yet. And I think we'll be really interested to see where this event goes. And as you mentioned, if it is successful, it could really kind of set the blueprint for IndyCar moving forward and how they can make events feel bigger without kind of going the Iowa route and having to hold two concerts that, jack up your prices for tickets, and also might offer something that not every single fan is necessarily interested in.
Yeah, and I think just one last point or 2 points before I know we got to get to your number one draft pick here in a minute, but obviously I'm fascinated, like you said, with the fan experience. You've got that overhang that looks like in the I guess graphic video that they put out of the track layout, and it looked like you could have fans over what looked like a bridge of sorts, which was kind of neat. I'm interested in two elements of this, and one is, I don't know if this is still going to happen now that Luka Doncic has been traded out of Dallas, but the fact that this was a top 4 sports market in the United States. Can this event bring in more partners for these teams? Because we both know how much the cost within the series has continued to rise at an astronomical level. And it's kind of hard for me to think about new cars and things like that without more partner involvement on a financial scale. And the other end of that is, how much does this event get pushed in 2026 when the World Cup is also going to be one of the hosts for the World Cup is Jerry World, right? Is AT&T Stadium. And knowing they're going to have a handful of games played at that venue, along with obviously several others throughout the country. But that first race is happening the same year the World Cup is coming to Arlington. How does that get pushed? What are we looking at from that? Does it help it? Does it hinder it? So those are small details. I think the one benefit with that is that it's here before the World Cup. Here 3 months before, roughly, because I think the World Cup starts. So, I look at that and I think, all things are moving in a positive direction at the very least. But those are some of the things I'm fascinated by. Now,
it's a big swing opportunity, but it's how long ago? I mean, it was 18 months ago that we were talking like the revamped Nashville street race was going to be the next big thing in IndyCar, and if you're listening to the podcast, you probably know what's happened to that event in the last 12 months or so. So I think, while as promising as this is, I'm going to hold off judgment to see what kind of an impact it actually can have until we maybe get one iteration into it, because big ideas sound great. And again, the Nashville thing was way more complicated than this seemingly, and it also failed for a variety of reasons that we could probably talk all day about. But the history of new street races in the IndyCar landscape over the last decade or two is not super great. There's a reason that the ones that we have on the calendar right now, Toronto, St. Pete, Detroit, Long Beach, am I forgetting any?
St. Pete, Detroit, Long Beach. I feel like there's one.
Toronto. Yeah. Those four have been on the calendar for decades. With, Detroit has some variations to it, and I guess a year or two stoppage here and there, but they are mainstays on this calendar, and we haven't seen the Bostons, the Baltimores, the Sao Paulos stick around, and it's because it's in Nashville even. I'll go back to it. There's a reason that these haven't stuck in the last several years, and that's because they are hard to put on. They're expensive to put on, and frankly, the sport has struggled over the last decade or two to branch out and create new chunks of a fan base in areas that it hadn't been to previously. Now, this is an area of the country that IndyCar has been and has been going to since the 90s, but we also know how those Texas Motor Speedway races were attended over the last 5 to 10 years or so. So hopefully with the season ticket holder lists that the Rangers and the Cowboys have alone, you've got kind of a jumping off point for the folks, the stakeholders in this event to work from. I know it's something that the Cowboys, I think, have been advertising like on video boards at just about every home game during this regular season, which is really cool. But we'll see. We'll see what kind of impact this race can have. It's weird that we've got an event that we're talking about that's not even going to be on the calendar this year. That feels like it was the biggest thing that happened this offseason, but I don't know that I disagree with you.
Yeah, I'm just kind of fascinated now, though. Like, we're talking about our number one picks for biggest storylines of the offseason, biggest things for the sport. I mean, what's Nathan Brown think for the number one draft pick here?
Yeah, so my pick here is I feel like a through line throughout this whole offseason. It has been kind of woven its way into a lot of big storylines, Arlington included, in the way in which that new race for 2026 was plugged on TV several times. And that's IndyCar's new relationship with Fox. We started to see the fruit of this new exclusive broadcast partner that IndyCar has landed, a deal that was announced back in June of last year. I feel like in Arlington was kind of the start of where we started to see this relationship blossom a little bit. The new race was talked about, I think, on a late afternoon Cowboys broadcast on Fox. Must have been in either late September or early October. And it was plugged a couple times, if memory serves me right. And then we move on to Michael Strahan being announced as the pace car driver for this year's Indy 500, along with the release of Will Power's Indy 500, and I think full season livery with Verizon. Verizon was, I believe, the sponsor of the pregame show for Fox's NFL crew. And so there was a lot of synergy there that got announced. And in between, you also had Fox going out of its way to pump up IndyCar in its college football broadcasts. There was a pregame show that they hosted in Bloomington, where Mark Ingram, ex-NFL football player, rolled up to the set in a show car, IndyCar. And then I think Graham Rahal appeared on another pregame broadcast briefly. It might have been the day of the IU Ohio State game. So this is a new relationship for IndyCar that already out of the gate, we haven't even had a race or a practice or anything actually formally televised for IndyCar on-track action that has already started to feel very different from what we felt over the last several years during the 6-year tenure of IndyCar's exclusive relationship with NBC. Now, I say out front, I feel like the folks at NBC did a great job, and I've reiterated this on social media a couple times, the ways in which I feel like it's kind of apples to oranges to compare NBC to Fox, and the ways in which this is a brand new product for Fox. They've never had IndyCar rights. It's the first time an IndyCar race is going to air on Fox, whereas NBC has had a piece of this in the general Comcast universe since, I want to say, 2009. They got the exclusive rights, obviously, at the start of the 2019 season, and they had chunks of races that weren't on ABC for several years there, not the 500, but seemingly just about everything after the 500 for several years before they struck that exclusive deal in 2019. And I think when you're NBC at that point, you already can trust that you have a group of fans and viewers that know what IndyCar is. And Fox right now is charged with educating their audience, and probably for lots of folks, showing them what IndyCar is and who its drivers are and how it's different from NASCAR and Formula One for the very first time. And so I think that's why, in part, we have seen this robust kickoff to this relationship, whether it be the Super Bowl ads that we saw just a couple weekends ago, the ways in which they've activated and woven IndyCar into their other properties that we already touched on, because they've now invested in something. And I think it makes perfect business sense to want to put everything that you feel comfortable into an investment to see what its ceiling might be. You don't want to go into year one of a 3-year deal with this and kind of soft walk it and get kind of marginal results, okay increases. Fox wants to know what the potential in the ceiling is for IndyCar from a TV ratings standpoint. And they'll know very quickly, I feel like, here, because I think we have seen the ceiling of what this, outside IndyCar broadcast pumping up of IndyCar is going to look like. There's no bigger platform than you can have to do that on than Super Bowl Sunday. And what we saw, like a half dozen IndyCar spots that probably totaled well over 3 minutes of airtime during the game. Those spots were going for $7 or $8 million. And I think we're going to see, St. Pete's not going to be the be all end all, but I think we're going to know probably by the 500 and certainly after the 500 exactly how well this relationship is going. And it's going to tell a lot about kind of where the sport is headed, I think, in lots of ways. So that's why I'm really interested to see, really interested to get this race season going. I don't want to rush through the first race of the year, but that TV rating number is going to be really interesting because Fox has put a heck of a lot of time, money, effort, manpower. They got Tom Brady to appear on a couple seconds of an IndyCar ad for Joseph Newgarden. And we're going to see what the near-term potential of this sport can be, because I don't know that, Fox is going to be able to do any more than they've already done this offseason beyond just having the repetition of broadcasts that we'll start to get into from a in-season flow standpoint here pretty soon. They'll obviously have some small spots. I'm kind of been told maybe a little bit more frequent than some of the just kind of self promo that NBC did in the IndyCar years that they've had over the last 6 years. But I think we're going to see the fruits of this really quickly, and we'll see kind of where it takes off. What have maybe been your biggest takeaways, and maybe what do you expect to see from the first couple weeks and months of this Fox relationship once we get this season going?
I think if the viewership is under 1.5, I'll be stunned for St. Pete, just based on the fact that you're looking at over $34 million in Super Bowl ads alone, which might be more than any of the promotional efforts combined that we saw last year.
I mean, heck, let's talk about. I mean, neither of us, I don't think, know exact numbers, but as far as I think we're both aware, that's more than Fox is paying for the rights to run IndyCar, period. Exactly. And more than NBC ever paid as well. So yeah. So probably a doubling of Fox's investment if you want to look at it that way in terms of what they're paying for a rights fee.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that because the estimation was like 25 million, if I recall, for the TV rights for IndyCar and Indy Next. And I look at this and I go, okay, there's two reasons I look at this and I'm happy with the direction of things where I'm very optimistic. One is, where are you on the totem pole? IndyCar with NBC, even though NBC did a wonderful job at a lot of different things, they were like slotted 8th on the totem pole, right? I mean, you're looking at it. You're facing Sunday Night Football, Notre Dame football. At the one point, it was also hockey. Horse racing is obviously very popular, which surprises me a little bit because I'm not much into it. Premier League obviously is massive, and
they have can't remember the terminology for it, but NBC had kind of like their like championship run, and the Indy 500 obviously was part of that. The Kentucky Derby was part of that. The Premier League. IndyCar was like one cog in that wheel in the summer. I think they had the French Open, another one to throw in there. IndyCar was a small fish in a rather big pond. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, 100%. And that's part of the reason I look at this and I'm like, okay, well, what are we looking at with Fox? Like, not only is this, not only I know they've got NFL on Sunday and they've got some Big Ten football and stuff like that, but what are they really fighting against in spring and in summer? I mean, maybe baseball selectively, but I mean, that's for the most part, that's about it. And I think that's important to note is just you're a little bit higher in the pecking order. And additionally, and this is stuff that I've learned through the grapevine, some of this was also what McLaren Racing CEO Zach Brown told me, which may have told you in the same thing, is, Eric Shanks is very much heavily involved. He's known Eric Shanks for a while and very much involved in IndyCar, very much passionate about IndyCar. I believe he's a native Hoosier too, if I recall. And Eric Shanks is also he was the understudy or the apprentice, if you will, from the guy that eventually went on to do the F1 broadcasts with, I think it was whenever he was doing it with ESPN or was it Sky, something like that. But he had left Fox and gone off. So there's some of those fun nuances that you would see in an F1 broadcast maybe could find their way into IndyCar on some scale because of just that trickle down effect, that education that he's gotten. And we've obviously seen what the fruits of that have been with different ways that they handle all sorts of different telemetries and knowledge to educate the fans. And I think that that's another element that was missing with NBC to some degree. I mean, there's only so much scale that they offered. And I think that that's where Fox can offer more. And I think that's also, I don't know how to say this in a kind way. I didn't think that you used Townsend and James Hinchcliffe to the full length of their abilities, because I don't think they were given all of the resources in terms of graphics, in terms of knowledge and intel. And I'm kind of curious if that changes with this. Does the entire scope of the broadcast change to present things that are maybe similar that make, I mean, even in F1, when someone's winning by 8 seconds, you look at that and you're like, well, this is boring as hell. But they still make it fun and captivating because they tell you the deltas, the over, the unders, the difference in tire combinations, to tell you the nuances of that, to tell you that, hey, this is still very much in play for something special for somebody. And they find a way to captivate you. And that's the trick, right? How do we keep people engaged and captivated and bring in new fans to engage them and captivate them? So being higher up on the totem pole, it being an Eric Shanks passion project from the sounds of it, I think all of that comes into play to make this really worthwhile. And that's why I'd be stunned if the number is under a 1.5 in St. Pete.
I don't have the numbers on me. I know a couple years ago, I think St. Pete drew I want to say in the like 1.4 range, or maybe I'm thinking of another broadcast. I know there have been a couple times where St. Pete's been in at least the 1.2s. Have to go back and look. But it's also, I think, been under $1 million. It might have been under $1 million last year, or right around that $1 million range. I think the important thing to look at this year, and the series has talked about it. And in fact, Mark Miles talked about it during last week's media availability when they talked about the leadership changes at the top of IndyCar. The series feels like it's experienced some decently solid single-digit growth. We can talk about how impactful that's actually been at another time, but they're looking for double-digit growth. I'm sure in revenue, in attendance gains, but a very easy way to spot and see if that is going on or not is in your TV ratings. TV ratings do not mean everything, but they mean a lot when you're looking at your teams who are going to sponsors and saying, hey, we want to get X dollars from you per race for our non-Indy 500 races. If those start to average out at 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 instead of network races that have actually really been fairly stagnant over the last several years. When you look outside the 500, they've really kind of teetered right around that 1 million mark. You would typically say like one above 1 million is a solid race, and under it is kind of where you feel like it maybe didn't quite meet its potential. If teams start to see those numbers I just mentioned, they're able to start asking for more money from sponsors. Other sponsors that are not yet in the sport might start to see this and think, man, those are about the same numbers that Formula One is drawing, or say Xfinity is drawing, or at least a decent chunk of your everyday NASCAR Cup Series race. And I can get in for a fraction of the price, particularly for a Cup sponsorship deal or an Formula One one. That's where I think you can start to see this sport take a leap, is when you get more consumer sponsors into the sport who are willing to activate around it because they see value. And those folks, at race attendance means something because those folks are obviously seeing those cars up close and learning about and hearing about and talking about and thinking about those brands. But TV ratings mean so much to these teams. And if those aren't taking a meaningful leap in the first half of this year, and certainly this season at large, when IndyCar is like the thing on Fox this summer, it will be very worrisome as to where this relationship goes from here, and what it means for teams as these costs continue to rise if they can't get more sponsors, or at least at minimum charge more from the ones that they already have. So I think this Fox deal is really pivotal as to what the next couple years in the IndyCar look, and I think it could have a decent effect on what the series looks like in 10 years or so. We'll go back to you, Joey, for number 2 on your list of our off-season big news story items draft. What do you have here in your number 2 spot?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and it's something that just happened not earlier this week, it was last week, but everything feels like it's run together this offseason. I think that it's interesting to see that Doug Bowles is now the series president, on top of being the IMS, Indianapolis Motor Speedway president, and that Jay Fry is out. I think that is going to be a very interesting thing to see. It's very interesting that it happened 2 weeks before the season, right? Like, IndyCar didn't make this call. Penske Entertainment leadership didn't make this call, earlier in the off season. You wait till after the Super Bowl, you wait till after we're really engaged to have the final test that's actually happening right now while we're taping.
Mm-hmm.
And, it puts so many questions in my head right now, actually, of just, one, what the hell happened that caused this to this point? Obviously we all hear things, but we don't have anything that's factual at this point. At least I don't. Maybe Nathan does. But the other end of that is, what does this do for the new car? What does this do for this rumored 2027 car that I still think is far-fetched? When it takes 5 years to come out with a hybrid engine, how the hell are you going to tell me that we're going to have a new car in 2027? Now, was there
a new car that probably has to be testing in 12 months?
Exactly. And what does that do with maybe Jay was the obstacle in that? I don't know. Maybe there was hindrances that Jay was trying to express, because I think maybe in some cases it's also an allocation of resources, right? I mean, how do we allocate the resources to put everything towards a new car when there's so many things in play? But I mean, I can go down the new car rabbit hole for an entire episode, honestly, and maybe at some point we will. But, I think to focus forward, Doug is wonderful for the sport. He's wonderful for Indianapolis Motor Speedway. He's a wonderful ambassador, and we all know that. And I'm fascinated, one, if he's going to get stretched too thin, because it doesn't necessarily feel like Penske Entertainment's hiring people. They're just giving people more titles and maybe give them a little bit of a pay bump. And where are we in the month of May? Like, does this situation with Doug, does he just handle dual roles, and then after the month of May, maybe we kind of just see like this is actually a stopgap and we appoint somebody else president of IMS? Is he strictly the face of the series now because he knows our sport inside and out. He's a wonderful person to talk to. He's very, very much involved in the fan experience, and he's very personable on many levels, which honestly is probably something that the series has been missing for a while, to be blunt. And so the fact that now you've found someone that can be personable, it's a wonderful thing, and probably a long-term solution on a lot of levels, right? I mean, because Doug is pretty young in an environment that probably could use a little bit of youth injected into it on some scale. So, but those are the things that Doug is good at: the fan experience, the promotional efforts. Doug is very smart at other elements of the sport. I'm not going to take anything away. He owned a race team at one point, right? So he knows exactly the importance of cost for these teams too. At the same time, probably aren't going to be his primary responsibilities. A lot of his primary responsibilities is going to be the promotional efforts, the fan experience. I'm curious what his involvement is for the other Penske Entertainment promotions, such as picking up Long Beach and things of that sort. Obviously Nashville, since that's another element of it that I'm sure we can get into at some point. So it really does come down to, okay, you're solving how to engage better with the fans. That's how it looks to me. What are you doing from a competition standpoint? And I know that they've appointed people with new titles and taglines and all this, and they've tried to move stuff around in the structure, but it's still the same people. You're less one now. Mm-hmm. So what are you doing to improve that? I mean, I was about to drop a bad word, but when I first started covering this sport 13 years ago, the cost, I could see some teams running on a $4 to maybe $5 million budget. That number is double now, at least.
Oh, yeah.
For one car, you're pushing 10 or you're north of 10, which means that a two-car team is operating at roughly $20 million.
Yeah, maybe your Dale Coins of the world, or maybe trying to squeak by at 8 or so. But as you said, not long ago was Dale sneaking by at 4 or 6.
Yeah, exactly. And so you look at this and you're like, okay, and you're going to talk about a new car on top of that, which is easily going to cost $1 million. That's not including probably having to wire the thing. And, oh, by the way, if we push the new car after 27, how is that going to help with manufacturer support? Or manufacturers going to get tired of the same song and dance? How do you engage with new partners? Does it become an Ilmore project at that point? There's just so many things that I think the trickle down effect is going to come to. And I thought there's a lot of things that Jay did really well for the sport. And obviously he's very beloved within the paddock, because you could see the support upon the announcement, the way that drivers stepped up and shared their stories about him and his impact. And I think that's something he definitely was pro paddock. And I think maybe a little too much pro paddock and a little bit not pro Penske in some regards. And that's kind of what it feels like to me.
Yeah, it's Jay. I had a team manager kind of explain to me Jay in their eyes, and they said Jay was the intermediary between the teams and Penske Entertainment. Not necessarily that's what what his role was meant to be, but that's kind of what it turned out to. He was someone who could advocate on behalf of the teams when decisions were being made at the very top of the sport, whether it be Mark Miles, Jonathan Gibson, Bud Denker, Greg Penske, Roger Penske, et cetera, et cetera. He was the person that when team owners or managers or drivers had questions about, I think, a lot of things, a wide range of topics, Jay was the one that was having those conversations, was taking those phone calls, was meeting with folks in the paddock inside the IndyCar transporter. And so I think there are some people in this paddock who feel like they lost that voice. Not to say that Doug doesn't have relationships with those same people or won't be able to forge those relationships. That's not to say that Doug is just going to be there to be a mouthpiece for Roger Penske, Penske Corp, and Penske Entertainment. But I think there's a sense in the paddock, and I don't know that it's an inaccurate one, that this is starting to feel much more like you have a nameless, faceless group or business that is making decisions rather than a president of the sport. Right before I came in, which was September 30th, 2019, which was something like 35 days before we had the Penske Entertainment announcement on November 4th, 2019 of the ownership change. I remember reading so many stories and going through transcripts and talking to people, and Jay was an active presence. He embodied the forward-looking mindset of this sport. He was driving innovation as much as you could have in the sport. He, is I think if I have my dates right, they announced the new engine package in 2018, and the next year came out with the addition of the hybrid that was supposed to come with a new car. And before Penske Entertainment got involved and took leadership and ownership and stewardship of IndyCar, tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like you had a fairly good idea of the identity and direction of where IndyCar was headed. And I know you throw in the pandemic that really shook things up for maybe 2.5 or 3 years to some extent. And so we are maybe certainly not where we would have otherwise been had we not gone through everything that COVID-19 wrought on the series and the world at large. But you think about the fact that a new car was supposed to come in 21 or 22, and now we're talking like 2027 at the earliest, maybe 2028, and uncertainty as to what the engine package is going to be, what engine manufacturers are even going to be involved in the sport. I think there are a lot of great things that Penske Entertainment has done for IndyCar and it is doing and will continue to do, but there's also, I think, a lot of uncertainty as to what the sport is going to be in the next couple of years. And it definitely has felt like we've seen Jay phased out in some way before he was eventually let go. And I think there's something to the fact that it seemed like he maybe didn't quite fit the mold of a Penske Entertainment employee or leader. I after the fact thought, kind of caught my attention when I was going through the transcripts of that press conference last week with Mark and Doug, talking about how Doug's not here to make any one decision, big picture decision by himself, that there's going to be committees and groups and meetings as we go forward, trying to figure out some of the answers to some of these big picture topics. And it makes you feel like
he's a yes man.
Well, no, I don't know that I would go that far. I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. It just feels like this series is going to continue to be basically whatever Roger Penske and Penske Entertainment see fit. And there's some element to that is like, well, duh, they own the series. They've paid for it. They take on the risk of all of these projects. And so, of course, they get to be the ultimate decision makers. But I know there are a lot of people that kind of feel like, Roger or the people very close to him just kind of make decisions, and there isn't a whole lot of an ability to disagree with those or suggest something that goes a different route. And I think Jay was a free thinker in some ways that brought a different perspective that didn't always maybe see eye to eye with those at the top of Penske Entertainment. And, you hear some stories about ways in which that might have led to some tensions that I think we heard some about in the background in September and October that maybe didn't immediately at that point lead to him parting ways with the sport, but ultimately did hear a couple days ago now. So yes, very shocking, very surprising the way in which it took place. And I think it's something that we will have reverberations of for some time as some of these really big decisions are made for IndyCar's future.
Yeah, I mean, one last point on that, because I know we're up against the clock to get even just your second pick up here, because we're long-winded about some of these big things. But Jay had this motto about IndyCar being fast, loud, and authentic. That was like, he had a lot of mottos, but that was his thought with the identity of the series. And I'm really fascinated with his departure to speak to that point that you said earlier. And I think this is an important point. What is the identity of IndyCar? We've all been asking that question for a long time, to be completely honest. Like, all of us in the media, all of us in the paddock, no one has been able to answer that question. Instead, actually, we in the media get asked by people in the paddock, what's the identity of the series? Which, when your own paddock is asking that question, you have a problem. With that said, I mean, I think Doug's going to do a great job. He's going to certainly fill a void, because I think that's the other thing is with respect to Jay. Jay was great for the paddock. Doug is great for the series. And
a good way to put it. Good way to sum it up.
Yeah, and I think both can be true. It's unfortunate that they both can't coexist in the same space, that there wasn't some sort of restructuring like there was with everybody else, seemingly. But, with that, I think Jay's going to be missed, and I'm excited to see what Doug can do, and I'm excited to see in what elements this can help push forward. I do think that if you're going to do it, having a new TV partner like Fox, knowing that he's going to have to be present, certainly makes sense from a timing standpoint. So, but with that, because we're up against the clock, what's your second round draft pick?
So I'm going to go related to my first one, because I think it made a lot of headlines, and I think surprised some folks, including myself, when I started learning about it and reporting the story out a little bit. I'm going to go with Will Buxton as the choice from Fox Sports to be the play-by-play announcer and lead anchor in the new look IndyCar broadcast booth. Because I think that pick, when it came, it came at a time a month or so ago where we were starting to see or hear about these ads that Fox was making, and maybe hearing a little bit about some of the technology that they were going to be use in the broadcast, and questions were starting to be asked about the graphics package and how this broadcast is going to look and feel different than IndyCar. I think there were a couple really safe potential picks when you kind of think of the names that might have been in the running for this job. And the names that come to mind in that realm are Alan Bestwick and Kevin Lee, both of whom have held this job in some capacity over the years. Kevin most recently to cap out the 2024 season as Lee Diffie transitioned to the same role in NBC's NASCAR booth. But the pick of Will Buxton, someone who is well known in the racing industry for his work particularly on F1 TV over the last several years, which he did kind of in a presenter role, essentially, kind of managing those off-track broadcasts in between practice and qualifying and races for F1 TV. The fact that he was the choice for your play-by-play role as someone who only kind of tangentially has been in the IndyCar world, someone who hasn't called play-by-play for a decade, I think is bold, and another example of the edginess and the risks that Fox is willing to take to try to take IndyCar to another level. I'm really excited to see what Will brings to the broadcast. I think he's going to have some growing pains. I think it's one thing to know a lot about IndyCar and love the sport and have lots of great relationships with the folks inside it, which he has had for some time now. But I think it's another thing to be able to kind of play referee in between Townsend and Hinch and set them up for success and call on track action, that's fast and furious, and weave in storytelling and, kind of communicate and execute the messages of a new look broadcast that I think is going to feel a little different than what we've seen on NBC. Not to say that, had Kevin or Alan been picked, that we wouldn't have expected just kind of some ups and downs to get things started, because I think everyone in the Fox world is gonna need some feeling out time to get used to this and get this broadcast to where they want it to be. But I think picking Will, who is well known for his work on Drive to Survive and connecting with that casual motorsport fan that was born out of the Drive to Survive F1 boom here in the US in the last 5 years, I think is creative. I think it was thinking out of the box. I think there's some inherent risk to it, but I think it's a move that kind of in lots of ways encapsulates what Fox is trying to do and the links in which they are willing to go to try to be different and not just be the NBC broadcasts with a different logo slapped on there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on every level with what you just said. And I think that the other end of this, and I don't think, maybe I'm a little disillusioned by the whole scenario, but having watched F1 for quite a long time, I haven't watched it as much recently, to be completely blunt. I look at this and I wonder if this actually, and because Lee Diffie is wonderful. Like, he was wonderful with everything that he did for the play-by-play. And it was wonderful to have Mike Tirico at the 500, because I think Mike Tirico is a pro's pro. But I look at this and I'm like, does this actually make it easier for IndyCar to go international in some levels? Because I look at his brand awareness. He's got 615,000 followers on Twitter or X or whatever the hell you want to call it. And our best driver's got 200 and something, and it's Pato. And, you look at that and he's 3 times the numbers on that. But also, as you just gave a wide background over his storytelling, his Drive to Survive connectivity to casual fans, he's called play-by-play back in the day for GP2 or F2 races, if I recall. And, there's so many things and there's so much depth to what he can bring. And his brand awareness is literally global. So I actually wonder if this makes certain pathways for Fox easier in terms of taking IndyCar international, to get back to Mexico, to maybe explore other possibilities outside of that. I don't know how far-fetched that is, but that's something that I actually think could open up an interesting pathway, which it sounds interesting, but TV rules all, right? So if a TV partner is willing to have certain involvements and they understand their own brand and they understand their own awareness and are not afraid to be bold, as we've seen Fox do so far, I don't think it's too far-fetched to say that this could be something that spurns things within IndyCar to go beyond the North American borders easier.
Whether that comes out of this or not, I think the addition of Will, when you are now more than ever trying to just create a larger awareness of your sport. If you go to a promoter in Mexico, or a promoter in Denver, or let's say if you're trying to add a race that might be a little similar to the model that we have with Dallas in the Northeast somewhere, hopefully, although this is not a hint that I know of anything that's going on that way, but I just know that would be great for the series. I think the ability to say, yeah, Will Buxton is our lead anchor. He has a awareness in the general greater culture landscape and the greater casual sports fandom landscape for, I would say, I think it's fair to say, more people than Lee Diffie. Not that Lee isn't fairly well known. He calls the Olympics. He does motocross. He covers other things for NBC, and I think he's about as big as you can get in the the gearheads that watch a ton of racing or have been fans of racing for a long time. Will Buxton opens some new doors from a social platforms. The fact that he's a New York Times best-selling author, the fact that he's appeared, on a hit Netflix show. I just think
it's a different kind of cachet.
Yeah, he's and when you're IndyCar, the biggest thing you need to be focused on is to get someone to come to a race who has never come to a race before, or to get someone to turn on a broadcast who's never turned on a broadcast before. That's where your focus has to be right now, and the way you do that is expose yourself to as many folks in as many different ways and on as many different platforms as you can. I think they've been doing a solid job at that with, getting drivers to an NHL game or an NBA game and making sure that you get them on the big screen, or getting Joseph on the Fox pregame show for the Super Bowl, obviously the ads that we've already mentioned. And I think Will just tweeting or posting on Instagram about IndyCar for those hundreds of thousands of folks that follow him because they fell in love with his Formula One coverage and on a couple different avenues over the last 5 years or so. Next weekend when he's talking about IndyCar, if they've never watched it, they might go and turn it on. And that's how you get from 1 million viewers to 1.5, is you have to grow that casual audience. Yes, you hope eventually that those casual folks grow to become diehard fans, but that is so far down the road. The way in which IndyCar begins to try and challenge F1 for that number 2 spot in terms of TV ratings in the US motorsports landscape, or even think about reaching half of what a cup broadcast is growing your casual fan awareness. And I feel like Will Buxton is a great tool to be able to drive that change here in the next couple of months.
I know that we're up against our own clock. We're past the clock, actually, of what our goal was for hitting. But I know we wanted to both make 5 points each.
Yeah.
So
let's run through them. Let's hear your let's alternate back and forth. Let's go hear your third, and then we'll kind of maybe just do a rapid fire for these last couple rounds.
Like that's kind of what I was thinking too, is like, because I think like quick hit points. So I think my third point would be Michael Andretti's involvement with Andretti Global and how that's become a catalyst from the appearance of it to spurning an F1 program. I look at that and I wonder a number of things. I wonder what his involvement will be on certain levels within strategy on teams and things of that sort. His level of involvement within the organization. Is this just a temporary thing and he acquires, I guess you could say, in some capacity, everything in a year's time? Or is Andretti Global going to get rebranded in 2026 to something that Dan Tauris, what is it? TSG, I think is the name of it, or something. TGS,
TWG, which stands for, I believe it stands for the Walter Group, after Mark Walter, who is of course the money behind all of this operation. Funny, the way someone framed it to me this offseason, I thought was really smart. Mark Walter has Formula One money. Dan Tauris has IndyCar money. Dan Tauris could run and own and operate an IndyCar team just fine with the fortune that he's built, but you're not going to get to Formula One without Mark Walter. And he's a name that you need to, if you're a motorsport fan here in the US, you need to become more familiar with. Go look up the ownership structures of the Dodgers, along with a Premier League team that is slipping my mind. You may be able to fill in the hole for me, but he is a billionaire several times over, and he's the reason why we have seen this rapid change in this organization over the last 5 years or so.
He doesn't own Liverpool, and so I don't know him. But that's my quick hit for my third is Andretti's involvement on that one. So, I mean, what's your quick hit third?
Yeah, I would say IndyCar taking a larger role in promoting its races. The biggest part of that, of course, is purchasing Long Beach. And running that, continuing to run that with Jim Calian and the folks that live out in Southern California that have run this race for decades. Not only does it ensure that this race stays an IndyCar event moving forward, but it means that if, let's say, for example, NASCAR were to really, really badly want to have a Southern California presence that they can't yet get out of the bones of Fontana, rest in peace, that IndyCar would, and Penske Entertainment, and therefore IndyCar's parent company would get that, $20 to $25 million check that we're talking about from the new TV broadcast. That'd be massive for IndyCar. But even if that doesn't happen, this means that Long Beach will now and forever be an IndyCar race. And I think that's really important because if you think about A, how big that market is, B, how historic that is to IndyCar's past, present, and future. I think it's safe to say now that there's no bigger race on the calendar outside the Sunday of Memorial Day weekend than the Long Beach Grand Prix. And I think there were some serious risk that could fall off if NASCAR or Formula One swooped in with an offer that the previous owners couldn't refuse. And to a broader standpoint, this gets stretched out to the fact that IndyCar is now promoting the Nashville Grand Prix. Really cool that, you look at it now, they've got their hand in some way, shape, or form, whether it's formally as the promoter or working, say, with the Arlington race that's going to launch here in 2026, co-promoting or co-operating. I think it's like half the schedule or more now. Really, the only folks that run or operate a substantial number of the races on the calendar that aren't Penske are the folks at Green Savaria Racing, which do St. Pete, Toronto, Mid-Ohio, and Portland. So I think this is cool that Penske Entertainment is investing in and taking ownership of more events, because I think they know what they want these events to look and feel like and how they want them to be marketed. At the same time, I think you have to be a little worried that, how do I put this properly? Well, that you don't have more people that see value in wanting to run an IndyCar race. The fact that someone like Scott Borchetta, is as inventive, and I think well respected and viewed in the motorsport space for the variety of ways that he's been involved over the years. Someone like him who took on the headache that was reviving this race and bringing it to Nashville Superspeedway. The fact that he's out in just a year is a little disheartening and makes you ask some questions. I think overall this is a good thing, but it's a little curious that you don't have more folks that are wanting to get involved in IndyCar, say outside of the folks that are doing Dallas. And you hope to, I guess, what I would say is you hope to see more. You hope to see IndyCar grow and become a value proposition to where folks want to and are in some ways bidding against each other to host and promote an IndyCar race. All right, number 4 for you.
Yeah. On that final note, though, for you is it's hard when you know that promoters are not becoming more prominent in the motorsports landscape too.
Mm-hmm.
That's as much as it would be nice because, promoters are going to help grow funding and money and effectively promotions maybe better than what Penske Entertainment can. At least Penske Entertainment is taking ownership of their brand when maybe they don't want to rely on promoters so much. But with that, number 4, I think Gavin Ward being out at Arrow McLaren is something that can't be understated as a big thing. There's so many ways that this could be taken, but to try to do it in a quick way, we know he's on a gardening leave for X number of months or maybe even for the full year, and that he'll probably turn up somewhere. within the IndyCar landscape. Who and with whom and in what role remains to be seen. But, I kind of wonder, I think as you do and many of us do, is what does this do for, on one end, we think Arrow McLaren is going to be fine, right? Like they've got Pato, their engineering group for the most part has stayed intact. The driver lineup is different, obviously, with Christian Lundgaard coming on board. And so there's been some interchanging parts to it, but in some ways, they almost thrive in the ability to have, even though everyone looks at the optics and goes, oh my gosh, like the turnover for them is so extreme compared to other teams. They're trying to get better. Like they in their viewpoint, they're doing these moves to push forward. And I mean, Zach Brown has told us that in that impromptu call back in Las Vegas GP weekend is whenever this news broke of Gavin. So that was in November. And so everything has been a catalyst to move things forward, and they almost thrive in it. And I kind of wonder, like you look at, maybe this is the best solution for everyone, because maybe there's certain things that Gavin wanted out. Obviously, I haven't talked to Gavin since then. I don't know if you have or not. He's been pretty under the radar, but maybe there was more out of what he was looking for from that role that he wasn't necessarily getting, and equally maybe Zach was hoping for more out of that role than he was getting. And so, and there's not necessarily, the optics say that Tony Kanaan is the replacement, but the reality is in title there is no replacement. This role has been broadened in a very Penske-like way, where it's filtered the role amongst numerous to have a council of sorts. So
there's a lot of similarities between this and the J. Fry Doug Bulls situation, for sure.
100%, yeah. And so I look at that, and I'm very curious how things will go with that team out of the gate, because they've been knocking at that glass ceiling for a while, and we think that it's only a matter of time before they shatter it. But do all of these changes limit their ability to shatter, or do they actually take the next step and Pato goes out there and kicks everyone's ass and wins 8 races out of the 17? So obviously that team is very capable, and they've been at the wrong end of a lot of things. But at some point, you'd like to see stability.
Yeah, I think you look at what Zach has done with the Formula One team over the last 5 or 6 years, his willingness to make changes whenever he felt like it was necessary, whether it was drivers, whether it was with team officials. He is not someone who has gotten to where he is in the business world and in the sports world without taking risks, without trusting his intuition, without making quick decisions, sometimes a little bit quicker than others might have. But that's what separates folks in those worlds, is making well-informed, quick, decisive decisions. And it got to the point this past offseason where, despite the fact that on track the team had the most success it's had in its history, dating back to the early days with Sam Schmidt founding this team and Rick Peterson and others. From a wins standpoint, Pato won 3 times, did finish what I want to say 5th in the championship. So he's obviously been a little bit better from that standpoint. But from a trophy haul standpoint, this team is as good as it's ever been. And then it goes and makes a big change at the top. I think that signals to you that there was a riff in the personalities between Zach and the others running this team, and what Gavin brought to the table. I think they're both great people, Zach and Gavin. I think they're 2 different people. And this offseason, McLaren, both in purchasing the remaining shares in this IndyCar team, and Sam Schmidt and Rick Peterson finally completely exiting the stage, along with this move. This is a McLaren-ified team. You are either all in the McLaren vision and culture, or you are out and you are no longer part of this team. And very interested, like you, to see what that means for this team in 2025 and moving forward. I think this could be potentially a great thing for both sides, but no doubt, no less shocking from a surprise standpoint when we got that release in our inbox. I'll move on to my fourth pick, and then we'll close things out. And I'm gonna go with Ed Carpenter Racing swapping out Rinus VeeKay for Alexander Rossi. Alexander Rossi was, I think, in lots of ways, the belle of the ball of the silly season market, dating back to April when talks between his camp and folks at Arrow McLaren and McLaren Racing at large began on a contract extension. And we all kind of know how that saga took place. McLaren made an offer to Rossi where he felt like his value wasn't being respected as a veteran, as a race winner, as a leader on this team, and he opted not to take the deal. They parted ways, I think, fairly amicably. Obviously, Rossi finished out the season, but he went looking elsewhere. There were times when it felt like it was maybe somewhat realistic that he could end up on numerous teams: Chip Ganassi Racing, Meyer-Shank Racing, Prema, AJ Foyt Racing, and he ends up at Ed Carpenter Racing, that I think some might argue is a team that is a massive downgrade from where he's been. I think you could certainly say it's a little bit so in terms of pedigree and past results, but I think there's a lot of potential with Rossi and what this team can be, what he can bring to them, what they needed in terms of a leader and a guy who could really help communicate and dictate car setup and help them both on ovals and road and street courses. Someone who I think really elevates the floor of this team. Maybe doesn't offer quite the speed or the ceiling that someone like Rinus might, but really intrigued to see what this means for this team moving forward. They're a team I'm going to have a keen eye on once we hit the track in St. Pete, and see what what timing and scoring says about how they do in practice 1 and 2 and qualifying. And but it was no doubt no less of a shock once we learned that the driver that was getting released and let go for Rossi was Rinus, because I think a lot of folks saw that as an option and wondered, man, what an awesome team a Rinus Rossi pairing could be. And obviously that's not the way things turned out.
Yeah, I mean, I look at that. I was stunned just like everybody else probably was. And it's with Rinus, I think that we all see this immaculate raw pace, right? And I really hate it for him on many levels because, we finally saw him kind of grow into his own. Like he wasn't the same after his bike incident that he broke his collarbone. I mean, the amount of pace he had before that was unreal. But there's so much from an engineering standpoint also that ECR has been handicapped with, that other teams, the AJ Foyt had Michael Cannon, for instance, for a while. And, you look at what Ganassi have and other programs, and even some of the smaller programs have had some top level engineers. And that's something that necessarily they haven't had at ECR on the same level as far as depth goes, And so I look at this and I wonder if I think Rossi has, how do I say this? And I'm not going to piss anyone off, but I look at VeeKay and I look at his raw pace, and I think he's got great raw pace, especially at the 500, right? But I look at Rossi and I see a guy who's got the experience and the ability to develop a team within the framework of what a car needs. And I think especially when you're looking at where the sport's going with the expectation that these teams have with a new car coming, that development is going to play a huge role within that next phase. So I actually look at this and wonder if, Rossi being involved is not necessarily to build for right now, but it's to build for next year, the year after.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think this is a play for this team's future, not necessarily what it can be in 2025. And I think there's also something to, sometimes relationships, just like they do in all facets of life, they run their course. Rinus and ECR had been together for 5 years. Rinus had spent his entire IndyCar career there. And, it got to a point where I think you asked questions on, is there anything more that this relationship, this driver team pairing can be? And I would argue that it kind of just plateaued. Renus was capable of grabbing a pole on a perfect day. He was capable of winning a race or finishing on a podium or a top 5 on an incredible day and an incredible weekend.
I mean,
But
I would argue too on that end, not to go crazy here. I get what you're going for, which is maybe it reached a point of being stale, but he also got a career best in top tens.
Yeah, he did.
I mean, that's the other thing is like the consistency was beginning to get established with him, and he was taking that next step.
Mm-hmm. No, I think if we started to see if those top 5s had been a couple, or those top 10s, if they had been a couple top 5s or a podium, or maybe you sprinkle a pole in there, I think this could have been, but it could have been a different thing. But I think if you look at, Rossi, there's no reason he can't rattle off top 10s with this team. And I think he also brings you more stability long-term, some more experience in the sport, maybe a better guy at helping take the engineering room in the right direction. I also think if at some point, we saw this with Joseph Newgarden with this team nearly a decade ago, whenever Renus gets to the level that you want him to be at ECR, you're essentially developing him for Chip Ganassi Racing or Team Penske or Arrow McLaren. Like it's this, I mean, unfortunately, the way this often works in this sport is those teams in the midfield. We've seen it with Alex Palou. We've seen it now with Christian Lundgaard. We saw it one year with Kyle Kirkwood, although I think that was fairly well set up ahead of time. The moment that these drivers start to show flashes of talent with these mid-level teams, there are going to be openings at top teams with veteran drivers phasing out or reaching the end of the road with, say, a veteran driver like Rossi at Andretti. And there's going to be openings, and teams are always going to be looking for what's next. And a guy like Renus VK, who's finishing, in the top 7 in points, kind of like Joseph did for multiple years there with ECR before he moved to Team Penske. That's exactly a situation that someone is going to excel and then move on. And I feel like Rossi, on the other hand, could have a really long runway with this team. All right. Before we finish up here, your 5th pick here of the big storylines that we've seen in the IndyCar offseason.
Yeah, I don't actually know if we've touched on this, which is staggering, but I mean, charters, right? I mean, I don't know if that's universal on your part too, but, I look at this and I think it's a storyline. How big of a storyline is it though? Because what difference does it really make? I mean, and I think that's part of what we're struggling with. Like I've only learned a little bit from what I've been told from various team owners, and I've seen a few things, but like it's all spotty, right? Like I haven't seen like the full on like book report of all the terms and conditions that comes with the charter agreement. And I think there's the optics of it. And I think that's important to express this too, is the optics are so important, right? Because fans nowadays are so educated. Everyone is so educated, partially because social media, partially because everyone's so outspoken, that the lack of transparency that's involved in this leads the optics to look like this literally doesn't do anything. Like I look at this and I go, okay, the top 25 are guaranteed with charter spots. The one team that's not, that has 2 entries, is Prema. I look at this and I go, but we're still doing leader circle where we got top 22 teams get $1 million. So how do we take care of those other 3 teams? Does it even matter if you're in the top 22 anymore if you have a charter? Probably not. Like I know the $1 million makes a difference, but you're guaranteed to be in a race no matter what. You can go in with a sponsorless car and who cares? And I mean, that's the optics of it. And now it's pretty public at this point. We've put in a system in place that make no mistake, CART was the first one that engineered it back in the day, 20 plus years ago. And the team owners like Chip Ganassi and them will tell you that it was from the CART era that was evolved within the NASCAR landscape on some level. And this is kind of a rendition of that. Well, we've got NASCAR teams that are in a lawsuit right now over a charter agreement. And I've seen some reports suggest that if NASCAR loses this battle, this legal battle, that charters are going to get dissolved or whatever else gets circumvented from it. And I wonder if it's putting ourselves in a box, and it's a box that one, we didn't need to be in. Maybe we did, but if we did need to be in it, then make it make sense with the points, make it make sense with all these other things. Like, I think there's just so much there that has yet to be answered that just feels like a lack of transparency. And so I actually truly don't know the benefit. And that's part of the reason that it wasn't in the top 4 of my list, is because, cool, you tell me it matters. Why? And I still am struggling to know why.
Yeah, I think if you have a team ownership pool in this sport who none of them have any interest in selling their team or dropping from 3 to 2 entries or 2 to 1 entry, then I don't know what this does. This, like, from my vantage point, I don't think charters do anything until they start to be sold and we start to actually see what the value is. And the value, from everyone I've talked to, is a really weird equation in which, from a truly a financial standpoint, the only monetary benefit that you get from owning a charter is the ability to compete for that leader circle contract. And right now that's worth $1.1 million per.
Yeah, there's no TV
year.
money like there was in NASCAR.
Exactly.
Right? I mean,
Yeah,
you're
not talking about payouts that get into get into 8 figures and depend on where you finish in the series and your history, and is something that can actually, like, make a massive dent in the ways in which you go and fund a race team. Now, I think there are several teams that not getting that $1 million makes putting a full season program together with a driver that doesn't bring a ton of funding very difficult. But if you truly look at it from a financial standpoint, I've had some folks say, this pays out roughly $1 million or so per year, and you would maybe look at wanting to recoup your investment on something like this in 3 or 4 years. So you say it's worth $3 or $4 million, but if there's truly no one willing to sell, then theoretically you can go and offer the types of the amounts of money that have been offered in the NASCAR landscape, 20, 30, $40 million. And if people just really, truly want to be in IndyCar, and this is the only way that you can guarantee you can be on the grid, because there've been some talks about, maybe Prema kind of only being allowed to be the only non-chartered team on the grid so that they don't have to run the risk of not making races outside the 500. If some of these teams are, and these owners just want to be in IndyCar more than anything, then you have to hold on to that no matter what someone offers you, because you love the sport and you want to be an active full season participant in it. So it's a weird calculus. Like you said, I feel like there are a lot of these the rules around it that are still unanswered, and hopefully we get some of those answers here as this season kicks back off, given the fact that this was announced early in the off season. But it is, again, as you mentioned, I feel like in some ways a system that was created following the path of least resistance. I feel like there was a way in which IndyCar could have really kind of rebranded is not the right word, but kind of reset the playing field in terms of, say, how many cars a team could have on the grid. I know we've now got a cap of 3, but there's a lot of talk on, what's the value of having, past 22 cars? Could you have limited it to 2 cars per team and capped it at 25 or 27 and maybe allowed for a couple more opportunities for folks who didn't have a charter and maybe wanted to either participate full-time without a charter or participate part-time to kind of get their feet wet in an IndyCar landscape. And this is essentially outside Chip Ganassi Racing having to drop from 5 to 3 cars. This gave a charter to every single team and entry that was already in the field. And I think there are some that would argue that you should have maybe reshaped what your grid looked like and maybe put some firmer stipulations and trimmed some of the fat in some ways. Obviously that didn't happen where we are. But I think the next 5 years of IndyCar could in some ways be determined very much by what this charter system does. And at the same time, if they don't change hands, then it means very little. I will go to my last, maybe somewhat related topic here before we finish up this episode. I think coming off of the back of what you might argue was a fairly buzzy and largely positive end to their season, the fact that Juncos Hollinger Racing changed both of its drivers. Obviously, one of them, Agustin Canapino, being dropped in the middle of last season with Connor Daly filling that number 78 car for the last 5 races of the year. And team also dropping Romain Grosjean, a driver who just a couple years ago we were hearing about IndyCar surveys when he hadn't even competed in a full season, and he was ranked as the most popular driver in the sport. The fact that he's now a reserve driver as a guy who spent 10 seasons in Formula One is kind of wild to me. The fact that team wasn't ultimately able to capitalize on Grosjean's popularity in the casual motorsport fan landscape, having that tie to F1 and Drive to Survive that he did coming into IndyCar. The fact that they weren't able to sell more consumer facing or really any consumer facing sponsors over the last couple of years, the last 14 months or so that he was tied to. That team was really surprising to me, and they take on a very different look in 2025 with Stingray Robb, who we all know is bringing a sizable check for his seat. Someone who's been with 2 IndyCar teams during his 2 years in the sport, and someone that I still showed some solid promise on the ladder system, but we're kind of waiting to see if this is all he has from an IndyCar standpoint. And Connor Daly, who has been in the news and is maybe someone that we might talk about a little bit more on our next episode, but someone who secured that ride, landed that ride here a couple weeks ago, and who I think was expecting to get a pretty sizable sponsorship bump from folks at Polka Dot, a relationship that he forged to land his Indy 500 ride with Ryan Reinbold Racing this year that has fallen through. I think there are a lot of question marks for this team entering this season. We heard talk, I'm sure you have, I know I have as well, dating back to probably a year ago, that Brad Hollinger, Ricardo Juncos' new partner, who'd been footing the bill a lot of the last couple of years to keep this team afloat and give it the resources that it needed to jump back into the IndyCar landscape with the costs as they are right now, just wanting the team to find other ways to pay for things. And if some of these question marks around funding related to Connor continue to matriculate, even with what Stingray brings to the table, I kind of wonder what the long-term future of this team is, and are they someone that might potentially look to sell off a charter at some point? That's if you're ranking teams that might be willing to do that, they're number one on my list. Don't know the viability of that or the willingness to, but I think following what this team does over the next 12, 16, 18 months will be really interesting. And it starts with whether they stay pat with this driver lineup. If Connor is given the ability to finish out this season, and what he might be able to do from an oval standpoint, like we saw at Milwaukee, where he logged a podium, which was massive for that team. or if they have to look a different direction. Really intrigued to see where this team goes through the rest of 2025.
No, 100%. I think that's a good call, and I'm very fascinated with the where they go with things. But I think the other end of that is I think it's not. I think everything was intentional with bringing in David O'Neill in May, while all this stuff with the charters, with everything else was kind of in discussions. They were trying to get ahead of it by bringing in like a former Haas F1 guy, and there's been a lot of restructure within that framework of that team.
Yeah.
I think I talked to David O'Neill on Saturday, actually, because I wanted to know more about the Connor developments. And one of the things is effectively, and this is a rough sketch idea, to paraphrase a lot of our discussion, but Stingray brings roughly 70% of the budget, right? So even though Connor's sponsorship of Polka Dot went by the wayside, that's not to say that his ride is necessarily in supreme danger. As I understand it, he's still 100% that guy for the 500. He's still that guy for the ovals. And there's that awareness that's been raised has kind of built up a level of awareness, or that awareness that he's raised has built up a level of understanding within other companies to reach out to him. And he may still be safe for the whole season. If there is the possibility of anything changing, it would be if somebody cut a bigger check for Road and Streets. That's how I understand it. But with that said, there's at some point, and I hate to go back to it, but there's so much instability across the board. I mean, McLaren's got some instability at the top. We talk about Juncos instability. Penske has some instability within their infrastructure with Tim Cindric. And so there's so many things, and there's so many things we haven't even touched on that we don't have time for because we're well over. But at the end of the day, it's easy to look at them as the target to say, if someone's going to sell a charter, it's them. I actually don't know how true that is, because I think Brad Hollinger is supremely committed to IndyCar. I wonder, in the framework of that charter, can it be evolved from now until 2031 to grow to 27 or 29 or whatever that number is, or does that fabric of that framework get reshaped to something that you proposed, which is 2 cars and maybe the third? I mean, it looks more like an F1 Concord agreement. Time will tell on that, but certainly Juncos would be an easy target on a number of levels for that, because of the fact that they're one of the newer teams, one of the lesser, further down the grid with how they're viewed with resources and management and things of that sort. But they still are a team that punches well above their weight. And I'm very fascinated to see, especially considering that they're one of the few teams without partnerships and technical alliances, how much they can continue to do that. And does that raise their profile to where we're not even thinking about them in this situation next year?
Great point. That'll do it for us on this off-season recap edition of the Inside Line. Here in the next couple of days, we plan to have a second episode here before we get to the season opener at St. Pete, where we will just kind of run through each team and just kind of break down maybe what their expectations are, how they've changed quickly, and maybe what our one big largest question is as they enter the 2025 IndyCar season. It's been a blast. If you have any ideas or questions you have for us, things you want to see us do with this new podcast platform, reach out to Joey or I on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. Again, we're pretty easy to find, and we'd love to hear from you guys. Rate us, give us a review, subscribe to the pod so that you know that we have another episode coming. I know it's been a little while since we had a new episode on this podcast feed, but both of us are really excited to turn this into a fun project that we hope takes off this season and gives you IndyCar fans maybe just a little bit different outlet to get your questions answered, get burning topics discussed from 2 folks who are embedded in the paddock, are really well sourced in all different corners of the series, whether it be drivers, teams, series leaders, what have you, and who are writing and reporting on it on a daily basis. Thanks again, Joey, for going on this ride with me, and really excited to get this kicked off and see what it turns into this year.
Yeah, absolutely excited. It's been a blast. This is the first of what is hopefully many, many episodes over the course of this year and in the future. And yeah, for those listening, I appreciate y'all. And like Nathan said, please hit us up on Twitter, X, and let us know some things that you're curious about, some questions that you have. And with that, I turn it over to you, and we get ready for the next episode, man.
All right. Thanks for listening, folks. This has been the off-season recap episode of the Inside Line. Thanks for listening.